We're going to be looking at histograms and frequency tables. Frequency tables can also be called tally charts. So let's look at a frequency table first. A frequency table is really just a method of organizing your raw data into a compact form. So it's looking at how many times a piece of data shows up between or inside the interval. So you can see here that 0 through 39 had one piece of data. 80 through 119 had 12 pieces of data. So it's really just counting up how many pieces of data show up within each interval. It's a good idea to make sure once you sum them over here, so I counted all my pieces of data, to make sure that you have accounted for all of your data in that frequency or tally table. A histogram is used to show a distribution of a variable, while bar charts are used to compare your variable. So if you look at these two examples, the bar chart on the left is showing the categories, where the histogram on the right is showing the distribution of the data. And so you can see along the x-axis in the histogram, it is basically a number line. So there will be no gaps in your bars because it's a continuous distribution of your variable, whereas a bar chart is a comparison. So you can see too, when I took that frequency table and turned it on its side, it is your histogram. The bars look exactly like your tally table. The class interval along the bottom is the same. The frequency adds up on the top. So you can look and see here that the largest number I had was 12, so I made sure that my frequency on the y-axis went to 12. And so basically your tally table really interprets straight into your histogram. But let's look at interpreting histograms right now. So when you're looking at this one, this histogram is actually recording the number of calls per day. So if I look at this bar here, this tall bar is 12. What that's saying is that on 12 days, I received between 80 and 119 calls. On 4 days, I received between 160 and 199 calls. The bad part about histograms, or the limitation, I guess, it's not a bad part, but the limitation on histograms is that I can't tell any detail within this bar. All I know is that I had between 80 and 119 calls. I can't tell if I had 100 calls or 90 calls because it's just giving me a range of information. So histograms do have some limitations, but let's answer these questions here on the right based on this histogram. It said, how many days had at least 80 calls? So when I look at this, 80 falls within this interval, and I know that on 12 days I received at least 80 calls. But if I think about that question, on this bar right here, on 8 days, I received 120 to 159. So that's at least 80 calls. So remember that at least means, well, if it was at least that, then it must be more than that. So I actually have to tally up all of these bars because each of those bars represent at least 80 calls. So on 25 days, I received at least 80 calls. So sometimes you have to look at that question and realize that it includes more than just one bar. It could include numerous bars. So how many days had 125 calls? Well, 125 falls right in here. But again, I can't tell. There's not enough information on this histogram for me to know how many days received exactly 125 calls. All I know is that 125 falls within this range of 120 to 159. So I'm just going to say no way to tell because there's just no detail in that bar. So then here's my next question. What was the greatest amount of calls? Well, I'm going to assume, and this is kind of an assumption, that 239 is going to be the greatest number of calls I received. And actually, I shouldn't probably do that. I'm going to change my mind on that answer. Because I wanted to keep my intervals even. So you'll notice each one of these has 0 through 39, 40 through 79. So in order to keep my intervals equal to each other, I had to go up to 239 just because I needed to keep my intervals the same. So what was the greatest amount of calls? I can't tell because there's no detail within that last bar. So again, no way to tell. So sometimes when you're interpreting these, you do have to assume, or not assume, but you have to look at more than one bar on occasion. So if the question was something like, how many days received at the most 79 calls? Well, at the most, that would be these two bars. So at the most, it would be 1 plus the 4. So at the most, 5 days received at the most 79 calls. So sometimes the interpretation does include more than one bar. So think about the question and what it's asking you. And sometimes you can tell, sometimes it's more than one bar. Sometimes, there's no way to tell. So when you're making your bar charts or histograms, I didn't mean to call it a bar chart. It is a histogram. The intervals need to be continuous. So once I decided that I was going to go 0 to 39, think about that. That's actually 40 pieces of data because 0 does count. So 0 through 39, that is 40 pieces of data. So there's 40 pieces of data in each one of these. And I made sure they were continuous, which is why I had to go up to that 239. The bars have no gaps because it is showing a continuum. So make sure when you do this, there are no gaps. We make sure too you have titles and you label your axes.